Welcome back viewers. I'm Dr. Surbhi Uniyal and I teach philosophy at Jindal Global Business School, OP Jindal Global University. We are doing a lecture series on philosophy of business in which we discussed that why is philosophy important in business and how we can adopt different philosophical tools in the organizational setup in order to analyze different situations that we might be in an organization and how these philosophical tools help us in solving those situations. Moving further, we will discuss that how ethics and moral reasoning as a branch of philosophy is helpful in the business. So, discussing it further, we know that ethics talks about rightness and wrongness of an action. That what is right that we need to do and what is wrong that we need to avoid. There are three normative ethical theories which helps us in evaluating it further, which tells us what is right and what is wrong. Those three normative ethical theories are utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. We will see how these three normative ethical theories helps us in a business organization to think about what is the rightness of an action. So, talking about utilitarianism first, which depends on where the action or the rightness of an action depends entirely on its outcomes. So, a business decision is justified if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is the implicit logic of cost-benefit analysis, and its great strength is that it demands empirical seriousness about consequences. Its weakness is that, in principle, sanction serious harms to a minority if the aggregate benefit is large enough. So, since utilitarianism or consequentialism is about the outcome, is about the ultimate consequence and thinking about the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people, though it's more practical, yet the only weakness of this philosophy is that it can sanction or it can justify serious harm to minority when the aggregate benefit is large. Kantian deontology, on the other hand, takes the opposite position, says that certain actions are intrinsically right or wrong, regardless of the consequences that it brings with it. Unlike utilitarianism, which is majorly focusing upon the consequence. So, the entire philosophy rests on the consequence of an action, and the rightness of an action depends on the consequence. While in the Kantian deontology, it's the opposite. Here they say that the actions are intrinsically right or wrong, regardless of what kind of consequence they would bring in. So, Kant's categorical imperative argues that treat every person as an end in themselves, never merely as means, is a direct and powerful constraint on commercial conduct. It prohibits using employees, consumers, or communities as instruments of profit, and it provides the philosophical foundation for notions of rights, contracts, and the absolute wrongness of deception. So, as per the Kantian categorical imperative, which states and which argues to treat every person as an end and never as a means. This is important in how we treat, in how we see our employees, our consumers and communities. So, it says that never treat anyone, be it your consumers, your employees or the community at large, as an instrument of profit. Since a general notion of business is profit maximization, in profit maximization, there could be cases where employees or consumers or the community could be taken as a means for the ultimate end, that is profit maximization, which has been criticized from the Kantian perspective, because we cannot treat human beings or persons as an instrument. They always have to be treated as an end in themselves. Moving now to virtue ethics. Virtue ethics, which is rooted in Aristotle, shifts the question from what should I do to what kind of person or organization should I be. It gives organizations and businesses the concept of corporate character. What is that? That is the idea that honesty, courage, fairness, and practical wisdom are not soft assets but constitutive of genuine excellence. Much of what contemporary management calls authentic leadership is at its root Aristotelian, because it is virtue ethics which helps us in investigating that what kind of a person I am as a leader, for example, or what kind of a leader I am, what kind of an organization should we have, what is the purpose of our organization. And thinking in these terms is thinking about the corporate character, that the idea of my organization would be thinking about fairness, to have as a leader, to have courage and honesty and commitment. These are certain virtues that we need to inculcate as a leader, as employees, and as an organization at large. That what are those values which we want our organization to run by? What are those virtues? How can I as a leader talk about my leadership from an ethical perspective, where I can inculcate virtues and act virtuously, also not occasionally but habitually? How do I always act virtually in an ethical condition that I might encounter? So how do I act fairly? How am I providing justice to my employees and other members or my customers? So this is what we learn from virtue ethics. And if we take all these three different normative ethical theories, we would know that how we can deal with different problems that we encounter by taking any of these ethical frameworks or normative ethical theories. Now moving forward, another discipline within or branch of philosophy that would be beneficial and that is beneficial in the business organization is logic or argumentation and decision making. So formal and informal logic, the philosophical disciplines concerned with valid reasoning, sound argumentation, and the identification of fallacies, are among the most immediately practical philosophical tools for business life. Why? Because it is through valid reasoning, it is through sound argumentation, and also by identifying fallacies which we might, let's say, we might encounter a fallacy which has been made intentionally or unintentionally. How do we analyze that? How do we identify that there is a fallacy in this, let's say, particular kind of commercial or particular kind of business deal, and how can we identify and solve it? How can we think about valid reasoning and sound argumentations. Therefore, this branch of philosophy is most practical tool, you can say, in the business life or in an organization, where the capacity to construct a valid argument, to recognize when an argument is invalid, even if its conclusion happens to be true, and to identify the specific fallacy in a piece of reasoning are skills of enormous value in every domain of professional life. Let's say in negotiations, presentations, strategic deliberations, policy proposals, and legal proceedings all turn in large part on the quality of reasoning involved. How do we use valid argumentation in order to think about different types of solutions? Because there are times when it assumes or when it seems that a conclusion is true. However, the whole argument is invalid. So one needs to have grounding in logic to understand what is a valid argument, because one might get misled when the conclusion happens to be true but the argument is invalid. So it helps us in identifying different types of fallacies and how these fallacies within a reasoning, how we can identify and remove these fallacies. So be it in negotiation, when we are negotiating in a organizational setup, how do we identify these fallacies? How do we think about a valid argumentation? So presentations, strategic deliberation, even policy proposals, all of these require that we have good quality of reasoning with valid argumentation, having a proper, well-structured reasoning format. So the study of informal fallacies is especially useful. For example, the ad hominem fallacy, attacking the person rather than the argument, poisons countless corporate debates, particularly in hierarchical organizations where the authority of a speaker is allowed to substitute for the quality of argument. So such understanding of, let's say, this particular type of fallacy, which is ad hominem fallacy, where we attack the person, becomes helpful in identifying that there is a fallacy that has been made in this particular situation. Or let's say the straw man fallacy, which is misrepresenting an opponent's position in order to refute an easier version of it, is endemic in competitive strategy discussions. The appeal to authority, the false dichotomy, the slippery slope, the hasty generalizations, these are regular features of boardroom discourses, and the ability to name and diagnose them is a genuine professional asset, because these kinds of fallacies can be made intentionally or unintentionally. So having a good understanding of how to evaluate a reasoning becomes important, because in such kind of fallacies it might seem that an argument is valid. However, when we go deeper, when we analyze it further, that's when we realize that this argument, which seems to be valid or logical, is in fact encountering different types of fallacies. So it helps us in diagnosing these problems better. Now let us talk about different philosophical models of leadership. Leadership is not merely a management technique. It is a philosophical question about the relationship between a person in authority and those they are responsible for. So, who is leading and the relationship of this leader with whom he is leading. And that helps us in identifying that what are the different models of leadership that we can adopt and how do they help us in looking at this relationship in a better way. So the great philosophical tradition have each produced a distinctive model of what it means to lead well. And these models remain the deepest available foundation for thinking about leadership in organizations today. So we can take up different leadership models from different philosophical frameworks, and each of these provide a well-established foundation to think about leadership in organizations even today. Let's talk about Plato. Plato is a Greek philosopher. He offers the earliest and the most ambitious philosophical account of leadership in the Western tradition. In the Republic, he argues that the only legitimate leader is the philosophical or a philosopher king, one who has ascended from the cave of opinion and illusion to genuine knowledge of the good, and who returns reluctantly to govern for the benefit of all rather than for personal gain. So we have seen in Plato's theory that how Plato talks about a king to be a philosopher king, because when there is a philosopher king, a person is able to analyze different concepts like the concept of good, justice, courage, etc. in a better way. Since being a philosopher makes a person a seeker of wisdom, and this philosopher king is someone who has a curiosity to know and who is able to analyze the concepts of good and justice better. So, relating it to Plato's allegory of cave, here where the leader becomes a prisoner who goes out of the cave in order for the search of wisdom to look for what reality really is, and not just limiting that knowledge to himself. In fact, coming back to the cave to tell others and to help them in knowing what reality is. So, a leader in such a kind of situation or the theory which has been proposed by Plato talks about how genuine knowledge of good is important and how a true leader would be the one who returns back to the cave to govern for the benefit of all, not for their own personal gain. So, for Plato, leadership is inseparable from knowledge. The unwise have no business leading, however charismatic or popular they may be. So, this model helps us to raise questions in contemporary organizations like who among us has actually earned the right to lead and on what grounds. So, in order to relate it in this particular context, in today's contemporary times, how would we look for the best leaders or who should be the leader? Is someone who is a seeker of knowledge, a one who is able to analyze the purpose of an organization, the purpose of how we can lead everyone together and how we can think about the benefits of all rather than our own personal benefits. How am I going to be benefited or what is profitable to me? In fact, a leader would be someone who thinks about the benefit of the people that he is leading, be it his employees or consumers and customers and community at large. So, how leadership from Plato's perspective helps a leader to be someone who is a seeker of knowledge, the one who is inseparable from knowledge, is the one who leads everyone together. Now talking about Aristotle. Aristotle grounds leadership in phronesis, which is practical wisdom, the cultivated ability to read each situation and respond appropriately beyond any fixed rule. It is a virtue developed through experience and honest reflection, not a technique that can be taught from a manual. So, from Aristotle's perspective, if we look at leadership, is grounded in practical wisdom, which is called phronesis. This is a cultivated ability to read each situation and respond appropriately by using practical wisdom. So, it is about how we can inculcate different virtues and how do we act virtuously in every situation that we are in, which is developed through habitual practicing of virtues. It is in, or you can say it is from the Aristotle's analysis of following the virtues and avoiding the vices. In doing that, one adopts a middle path, which is avoiding the extremes. So, a leader should be someone who is not driven by or who is not moved by the extremes or who does not take actions in extreme. Rather, a leader should be someone who follows the middle path, and which is in fact the virtuous path which he should take. For example, again if we look at profit maximization principle, from the Aristotelian perspective, if there is an organization which says that we are not focused on profit maximization at all, or there is another position who would say that we are only focused on profit maximization, both of these situations are extremes. Why? Because the one who says that we will not focus on profit maximization or we will not think of profit at all would not be able to sustain. So, in order to run a business, profit maximization or profit making is important. However, it is not the end goal. So, it is not the telos which is not the final cause or the purpose of an organization. Rather, it is just means. Or if you take another extreme position which says that we will only focus on profit maximization, well, that is also an extreme, because that is an excess where organization is focusing only on profit maximization, and to do that it might involve unethical practices. So, now what would be a middle position in between these two extremes? Would be that profit making is our means, not our end, and along with profit as a means, we will talk about the benefit of the community or the people that we lead. So, that would be a middle position between these two extremes, and we learn that a leader should be someone who is able to know these middle path and is able to avoid the extreme positions, and he is able to analyze that what is the telos of their business or what is the telos of their organization. So, thinking about this telos and adopting virtues as a habit would make a person an effective leader, and this is the leadership model that we can adopt from Aristotle. Let's now take another leadership model from the Indian perspective, and I'll talk about Bhagavad Gita more specifically and how it articulates Nishkam Karma, which is the action without attachment to its fruits. So the leader acts from duty with full commitment, free from ego and free from the fear of failure, which produces a quality of clarity and decisiveness that self-interested leadership cannot match. So, taking the principle of Nishkam Karma, which is performing an action without attachment to its fruit, make a leader dutiful, because a leader would do what is right irrespective of the consequences that would come in. So, the leader acts from duty and with full commitment, and in doing so the leader is free from ego, it is free from the fear of failure, because he is not concerned about the consequences of the action. He is concerned about the quality of the action that he is producing out of his duty. So, what is the right action that one ought to do is the correct way of thinking for a leader from the Nishkam Karma principle. Now, let us quickly talk about how self-reflection helps a leader. So, philosophical self-reflection enhances leadership effectiveness. It emphasizes introspection about personal values, virtues and beliefs, showing how such reflections lead to ethical clarity, behavioral change and improved decision making in leadership roles. So, for a leader, it is important to inculcate this habit of self-reflection, because self-reflection helps a leader to introspect these personal values, virtues, beliefs about ethical clarity, about how a decision has to be taken or the decision that has been taken, whether that is the right decision or not. All this is possible through self-reflection. So, leader is not only a technical or managerial activity, it is deeply philosophical in nature. Every leadership decision reflects assumptions about values, human nature, power and responsibility. So, through introspection, leaders can align their actions with ethical principles, improve their judgment and respond more thoughtfully to complex challenges. So, we can see that how philosophy is important even for business organizations, even for leaders to think about how to lead and to build a relationship with those whom they lead. So, we will end here, and we will talk about more about what all can be discussed in philosophy of business. Thank you for being with us.